Let me begin with a story of a prisoner who receives a letter from his aging father. The letter reads, "Dear son, it looks like I won't be able to sow our field this year as I'm getting too old to do all the digging without your help. Love, Dad." The son then replies, "Dear Dad, please don't dig up the field. It's where I hid all the money. Just wait till I get out. Love, Ben." Well, the next day, the police show up at the father's farm and dig up his whole field and find nothing. The son then writes a second letter. "Dear Dad, I take it the police have dug up your field by now as they read all our mail. All ready for you to plant your crops. The best I can do from here. Love, Ben." Now, the reason I tell that story is because it highlights how little a person can do when they're locked up. So that son found a very clever way to help his dad out, but it's unusual for an incarcerated person to be able to do much at all. And this is Paul's point in our passage today, right? He's writing to a bunch of Christians who are in danger of locking themselves up under what he says, quote, is the yoke of slavery. Verse 1, the yoke of slavery. And Paul says doing so will seriously inhibit your Christian life. So it's like when I took my new dog for a run this week for the very first time. So I generally run around an oval down the bottom of Homer Street. My knees prefer the grass. But I wasn't sure if a 6-month-old puppy could handle a 7K run. And so what Deb said was, look, how about I come with you? I'll just sit over on the side with my laptop and do some work. And when Miri, the puppy, has had enough, you just bring her over and I'll look after her. I thought, great idea. The problem was, every time I ran past Deb, Miri would drag me over towards Deb. And so every lap, I'm trying to drag this puppy along for almost a quarter of a lap. And so after 4 or 5Ks, I was exhausted. All right? And this is what Paul is getting at in this passage. He's saying there's a particular error. You're prone to this error, all right, that is like running with a dog who wants to go in a different direction. See, not only does this yoke of slavery slow you down in your Christian life, it actually means you don't get as far in your Christian life because you're utterly exhausted. It inhibits us from becoming the kind of Christians we all want to be. So I'm yet to meet a genuine Christian who actually wants to remain just as moral and selfless and loving as they are today, right? Most Christians want to become more like Christ. And Paul says, look, there are 2 ways to do this. We can either work really hard externally, or we can be changed internally. All right? We can either train ourselves externally, like running with a dog who wants to go in a different direction, or we can be changed internally, like growing wings. And I've got 3 points today to help us find this real change as Christians, as you can see on your sermon outline. So, Paul begins by outlining what this all too common error looks like. I've titled that, What Christian Slavery Looks Like. All right. We'll then see why Paul is concerned enough to bring this up again. I mean, he's talking about the same thing again. So I've titled this, Why Christian Slavery is a Problem. And then we'll conclude with our application, which is looking at how we can combat this issue, titled How Christian Slavery is Overcome. But please understand, our goal today is not physical exertion. All right? We are not trying to train ourselves to be better at running or jumping. Our goal for today is to be transformed. It is to get wings. All right? And so the way to really grow as a Christian is to become a completely new creature. And if that's something that interests you, please stick with me as we look at what Christian slavery looks like, why Christian slavery is a problem, and how Christian slavery is overcome. So our passage begins with what most commentators say is the programmatic verse of the whole letter to the Galatians, Galatians 5 verse 1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. So what's Paul saying here? He's saying that before these Galatians turned to Christ, they were slaves. Now, most non-Christians prefer to think of themselves not as slaves, they prefer to think of themselves as free. Okay, they look at Christians and say, look, you've got a whole bunch of rules and regulations you have to follow. We're the ones that are able to do whatever we want. We're free, all right? But what they fail to realize is there are types of slavery that are visible and types of slavery that are invisible. Let me explain. So, for example, the woman working the streets is caught in a visible type of slavery, isn't she? People losing their paycheck each week to the pokies are in slavery, a visible slavery. Those who are addicted to alcohol or drugs are all dealing with a very visible slavery. We can all see that. But here's the thing, there are invisible slaveries as well. Right? The person who works 70 to 80 hours every week is a slave. Right? If you cannot stop working long hours, you're a slave. The person who has to make yet another $1 million is a slave. The person who is constantly checking their latest post to see how many likes they have is a slave. Right? They're completely under control of these idols. And Paul says, Jesus has saved you from this slavery, right? He's pulled you out of the river and put you on the stable bridge that is grace. But, he says, you Galatians are in danger of falling over to the other side of the bridge into what is called legalism. All right, the gospel of grace is often described as the solid ground between license and legalism. License being doing whatever I want, and legalism being, well, I need to follow all the rules. And he says you're in danger of this legalism. You can see it in verse 3. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. Now, what's he talking about there? All right, circumcision was the outward sign that you belonged to God under the Old Testament. The New Testament sign is baptism, right? Same kind of thing. But Paul is using circumcision here as yet another example of religious rituals that people have to follow in order to be saved, right? So he's already talked about following the Jewish food laws. We saw that a few weeks ago. Last week, he was looking at the Jewish calendar events, okay? Here, he's using circumcision to describe the false gospel. Right, which is really no gospel at all, remember? So what's the difference? Okay, so the gospel of grace says, believe in Jesus and you're saved. Then obey. The anti-gospel says, believe in Jesus and obey, then you're saved. All right, and so the difference between the true gospel that Paul taught and the false gospel that the Judaizers taught is very small. Both Paul and the Judaizers talk about faith and obedience. But Paul says the reason I tell you to obey and the reason the Judaizers tell you to obey actually create two completely different worldviews, two completely different religions. Now, you may be tempted at this point to think to yourself, well, look, we've heard this before a couple of times, Brendan. Aren't we just going over old ground here? One of the people in my Bible study this week said, look, Paul's just repeating himself by this stage. And they're right. He is. But our Bible study this week had the best discussion I think we've ever had as a group. So my goal each week is to try and spark discussion, not just give pat answers to whatever questions I'm asking, all right? And we have varying degrees of success each and every week, but this week, the conversation just flowed. And the reason it flowed was like I just sat there for a half hour as each person opened up about how they are sometimes tempted to do the right thing for the wrong reason. Right? So, for example, sometimes I obey because I'm afraid of going to hell. This is what Christians sometimes think. Sometimes I obey because it's what my family and friends expect of me as a Christian. Sometimes I obey because if I upset God, then he may not answer my prayers. Sometimes I obey because I want something from God and I figure he'll owe me if I'm good. Right? And so look, we might think that Paul is repeating himself needlessly in this passage, but maybe he's repeating himself because he knows how we frail creatures need this drilled into us several times before it sinks in. And that's what we saw this week in Bible study. People finally opened up about how we are actually tempted in this way. All Christians are. All right, unless you've somehow miraculously reached perfection, all right, hands up if you're perfect. Everyone here will be tempted by this yoke of slavery. Every Christian is tempted to stray from the gospel of grace into legalism. And so, look, the first reason Paul is really harping on about this is because he knows we're slow learners. The second reason he's harping on about it is because he knows Christian slavery is a problem. He tells us so in verse 4. Right, you got it there? You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. Man, what a line. The Bible has quite a few one-liners that pack a punch. One of my favorites is Proverbs 12, verse 1. Proverbs 12:1 says, whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but whoever hates correction is stupid. How about that? The Bible calling you stupid, right? But if we were to put together the Bible's top 5 most impactful lines, I reckon Galatians 5 verse 4 would be in contention. You have fallen away from grace. Now that doesn't mean you've fallen away from Jesus. All right? The Bible is very clear that once you're a Christian, there is nothing anyone can do. There's nothing Satan can do, nothing atheists can do, nothing even you can do to change that. All right, in John 10:28, Jesus says, no one will snatch them out of my hands. All right, so what Galatians 5:4 is getting at is he's saying you Galatian Christians are no longer living under the freedom, the security of that stable bridge called grace. You've fallen back into slavery. All right, you're thinking that it's your behavior, your efforts, your works that are somehow contributing to your standing before God. And like I said, we're all tempted to be pulled back into this type of slavery. But when we do that, it locks us up. Let me explain. As some of you may be aware, we went through a tough time as a church about 4 or 5 years ago. So what happened was I had to make some difficult decisions and stand some people down from leadership. Now, while some people criticized me for making those decisions, I actually in the end had no choice. All right, the bishop, the PSU, the whole ministry staff all agreed that these decisions had to be made. Other people criticized me for how those decisions were handled. And look, can I say, as a first-time rector who'd never had to deal with this before, I made some mistakes. Some of the things I did could have been done better. Well, a couple of months after, I was talking to an old friend of mine. I caught up with him for dinner. His name's Sean. And I was explaining to him, well, you know, he says, what's going on? I explained to him. And he listened and he said, how are you feeling? And I said, pretty bad, actually, now that you ask. And he said, why? And I said, well, I don't like making mistakes and I don't like seeing the church hurt. All right. And he said, well, why don't you like making mistakes? And I said, well, I don't like hurting people and I don't like looking like I'm incompetent and I feel like I've failed God as a leader. And Sean said to me, Brendan, God knows you're going to make mistakes. God even knows you're going to sin. And he's taken that all away. Now, what Sean was reminding me of is once you're a Christian, your relationship with God has nothing to do with your righteousness, your good works. It has to do with Jesus' righteousness. Right? No mistake or sin can make any dent in our relationship with God. Have a look at verse 6. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. Now, what does Paul mean? It means as a Christian, nothing we do, whether it's good or bad, has any value to our standing before God. Now, having said that, if you remain in license, okay, if you continue to do whatever you want, then you probably haven't been pulled up onto the bridge of grace by Jesus yet. Right? The gospel still says obey, but as a response to salvation. Paul's point, however, is that is about the wonderful freedom that the gospel brings, which is God's acceptance of us is not based on our performance. It's based on Jesus' performance. Now, if that's not enough, Paul reminds us of what else is in store for God's people in verse 5. Where is it? For through the Spirit we eagerly await by faith the righteousness for which we hope. Now, unfortunately, the Greek word for hope there actually means the exact opposite to what our English word means. Right? So in English, when we say I hope, what we're saying is, look, I'd like it to happen, but it's probably not going to happen. Like, I hope I win the lotto. Right? But in the Greek, it means certainty. Sadly, there's just no word that we can, use to accurately translate it. But what it means is that those who have had their sins forgiven can be certain that we're going to heaven. And this is the second reason Christian slavery is such a problem, right? Not only are you crushed every time you make a mistake or you sin, if you are, if you're under the yoke of legalism, right? But it means you have no certainty of eternal splendor. Why? Because you can never know if you've done enough. Friends, all Christians are tempted to do the right thing for the wrong reasons. But why this is such a problem is because it takes away our joy of being a child of God, and it takes away our assurance that one day we will see Him. So, if we're all tempted by this problem, the million-dollar question is, how do we overcome Christian slavery? How do we avoid falling into legalism on the one side and license on the other? Because it's a very narrow path to walk, this path of grace. All right? It's very easy to think, oh, look, it's all about the rules on the one hand, but it's just as easy to think, look, if I'm forgiven no matter what, then I can just keep on sinning on the other side. All right? It's like if a HSC student gets an early entrance into uni. Well, will they not be tempted to slack off for their final exams? All right, so how do we overcome this? Well, friends, it's by remembering that Christianity is not a matter of rewards, it's a matter of relationship. I'm not sure if you remember, but about 10 years ago, there was a speaker up at Men's Convention. His name was Bob Glenn. I've actually mentioned him in previous sermons. And Bob Glenn said, most of our horizontal problems in life are due to our vertical problem. And his application was, fix your relationship with God and everything else will sort itself out. Right? What he means is, the gospel of grace is a greater incentive for holy living than works. Gospel of grace, getting our relationship with God working through grace, is a greater incentive to obey than working really hard. So let me explain. A few weeks ago, we got solar panels on our roof. So I went out about mid-morning just to say hi to the guys. How you going? Can I get you a drink? Can I get you a can of Coke? There was 4 of them there. They said, yeah, we'd love that. And so I got them all a can of Coke. Really simple, all right? Really simple thing to do. Well, yesterday, the foreman showed up at our door, knocked on our door, and he said, look, when we were here, we noticed that you had a whole bunch of cracked tiles in your roof. And they're actually quite difficult tiles to find because they're a smaller size. And so for the last 4 weeks, I've been trying to source some of those replacement tiles for you free of charge, and I'm here to install them for you free of charge. And I said, that is a wonderfully nice thing for you to do. Why are you doing that? And this is what he said to me, all right? He said, when you come across a nice client, it makes you want to go above and beyond for them. Now, friends, that's how it is between us and God. When we realize just how amazing God is, it makes us want to go out of our way for Him, right? This is how we become a new creature. This is how we get transformed. It is to realize how much God has done for us. Because when we do that, we stop obeying out of fear of hell or selfishness that I want something, and start obeying Him out of gratitude. So how do we build that relationship? Well, it's by realizing how much God wants to be in a relationship with us. Deb and I have started watching The Chosen together. I don't know if you've heard of The Chosen. It's a TV show about the life of Jesus. It's crowdfunded. You would think it's really cheesy. It is amazing. Right? It is amazing. They take a lot of poetic license. They take all the gospel characters and they add a whole bunch to their stories to sort of flesh it out, but to make it like true to the gospel, all right? And so it's in its third season now. I think they're recording its fourth season. We're only 3 episodes in, but can I tell you, after 3 episodes, I recommend that everyone here should go and watch it. It is amazing. But in the first episode, we're introduced to Nicodemus and Mary Magdalene, all right? And so Mary goes by the name of Lilith, the reason being that she's still in her demonic phase, all right, when she was being horribly, horribly oppressed by these demons. So we learn, I mean, this is all added to the Gospels, but, she lost her father at a very young age. She basically found herself in prostitution and she was being horribly, horribly oppressed by these demons. Now, Nicodemus she was suffering so bad, they actually asked Nicodemus to go and see if he could exorcise these demons, which he couldn't. All right, he ends up by saying, only God can heal this woman. She was in a horrible place. By the end of the episode, she reaches rock bottom. She goes to the local pub and she knows the bartender there, and she laments to the bartender friend of hers that no one can help her. And so she says, look, can you just give me a drink so I can forget? As he sets the drink in front of her, we're introduced to Jesus for the first time when he puts his hand on Mary's. He says, that's not for you. Lilith, as she goes by, pulls her hand away and says, leave me alone. And she walks out. Jesus follows her. And Lilith says again, leave me alone. And Jesus calls to her, Mary of Magdala. She turns around. She goes, how do you know me? And he then quotes to her a Bible verse that her father used to recite for her when she was like 5 or 6. It's from Isaiah 43, verse 1. Thus says the Lord, who created you and formed you. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Mary then breaks down and falls into his arm, and Jesus embraces her. Now, if you were here last week, you recall that being a Christian is not primarily about us knowing God. It's about God knowing us. All right? Galatians 4, verse 9. Now, I watched that scene about 4 or 5 times this week, and I cried every single time. The reason being, that is how everyone becomes a Christian. All right? Every single one of us was running from Jesus at some time. We were saying, leave me alone. Jesus came to redeem us, and then he called us by name. All right? Jesus knows our deepest, darkest secrets, and he calls us anyway. And he tells us exactly what we need to hear to soften our heart. And when we fall into his arms, he embraces us. Friends, do you see your Redeemer? Do you see what he has done for you? He's done it all. And by all, I mean, even when we do the right things for the wrong reasons, right? When we obey out of fear or selfishness, he forgives us for that too. So brothers and sisters, Earlwood Anglican may not be in serious danger of someone coming and cutting in on us, like verse 7 says, but we are all tempted in some way or another to think, God loves me because I did this good thing. Right? What I pray we'll remember this week is that kind of thinking is Christian slavery. It's like running with a dog who is dragging you in the wrong direction. May we rather recall the gospel of grace that leads us to say, I did this good thing because God first loved me. That is true freedom. As Paul said, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free.